Let's jump into it. Today is a really fun topic and one where you will be really engaging with how you think about yourself. So, a lot of introspection. There's going to be a lot of self-reflection that's meant to help your learning. So, if at any moment in today's session you find yourself reflecting on how this content applies to you personally, that's great. That's the idea. Lean into that mechanism, lean into that process that's happening, question a little bit about where your mind has gone based on whatever prompt I've given you, and then try to backtrack, kind of like an investigator, see how you got to that conclusion. So, for example, we're going to talk about different types of the self. If I'm talking about an idealized self, and this will make sense a little bit later on, and you find yourself reflecting on what you think an idealized self is, and then you start reflecting on what your idealized self is, don't feel like you need to quickly come out of that to jump into full attention to the lecture. Feel free to lean into it for a moment. The pace of the lecture is meant to let you zone into your thoughts and zone back into me without really missing a beat. Plus, that's why the slides are so detailed so that you can keep those notes on hand. Lean into that introspection process because it will help your learning here. So general housekeeping, we're not in a lecture hall today, so this is really brief. Basically just a thank you everybody so much for your flexibility in switching to the online format. I would also love your feedback at the end of the session if you thought it actually worked well or if it didn't work so well. It's just helpful to know now that we're out of COVID, is the online teaching actually still helpful for you? So do feel free to give me feedback on that if you like. Today we'll have 2 teaching blocks and then 1 interactive discussion, which hopefully we can engage in together. We'll see how much time we have for it, but the interactive discussion is going to preface us for a really intense lecture next week. Well, not lecture, I'll say session. It's not really a lecture. You'll see when we get there. So today we're talking about self and identity. These are some of my favorite topics, so I'm quite passionate, and please do feel free to ask questions because even beyond the core curriculum of this course, I have a working knowledge of these concepts as a researcher and just as an academic in psychology in general. So I can probably answer most of your questions if you have them. And if you're doing a dissertation that's linked to the topics of self and identity, try to see how what we're learning today might apply to your projects. We're going to be going through these concepts and some theory in consideration of the role of research in giving us these theories, first of all, but the role of research in pushing these theories forward and looking at how research can capture really abstract concepts and almost quantify them. I say almost because obviously when I say quantify, as research students, you would think quantitative methods probably, but I don't just mean quantitative methods. I just mean research makes the abstract and intangible somewhat more tangible and measurable in psychology. So we're going to start with a brief introduction about the self. This is just the structure of our lecture today. We're going to talk about how different fields or different points in psychology approach the self differently, and we'll specify what the self is within social psychology. Then we'll go deep dive into the self. We'll talk about what the different components are, and then we will focus on key components to really deep dive in terms of, as social psychologists, what can we do with this information? What can we do from this point of view? And then we will come a little bit out of the self and into the broader mechanism that the self works within, which is identity. So identity is the larger umbrella, one of the larger umbrellas, because the self is really integrated into all elements of our life. But identity is one way that we can see the self working. So getting started with block 1, we might run a little bit longer than 4:35. I changed the slides up since I put that time. You will have the modern slides if you downloaded them from the Learn page. I just forgot to remove this time block here. So introduction to the self or self-knowledge is going to be the focus of this first block. And really what we're thinking about is the mechanism of the self in our experience as human beings, in our experience as social animals, in how it shapes the way we function in social contexts and in societies, how it shapes our relationships or is shaped by our relationships. So this is the influence of others on the individual. And once you have relationships, which we generally develop as a child, you have that schema or framework for what a relationship is. We then enter the territory of the imagined other. So last week we talked about how social psychology is looking at the role of the individual. Usually the role of the individual when it's in contact with groups, when it's in contact with other individuals, and when it's in contact with either of those two categories, even in the imagination realm. So as we develop the knack for relationships throughout our lives and we sort of collect people as we go through our lives, they also can exist in our imagined domain. And also archetypes of people can exist within our imagined domain that interacts with our sense of self. We see this all the time through self-expression, which we'll talk a little bit about today. But self-expression could be anything from a behavior, like a hobby that you're involved in, such as dance or drama, even object-linked hobbies, like if you like to do makeup for fun, I would say that's a hobby because it's for fun, it's not for money, so it wouldn't be a career, although your career choices could also be a self-expression. It could be anything from the clothes you pick in the morning to the words that you choose to speak when you're interacting with someone or the way you choose to speak those words. So if you're from, for example, if you're from a country where your first language is kind of an adaptation of a main language, like for example, a lot of island communities will have their version of whatever the main language is of that region. That can also be something that people play with in terms of their self-expression. Hi, welcome. So we see this sort of thing all the time, and it means different things to different people. So from the scientific perspective, we want to make sure that our definitions for key terms are always really clear, particularly amongst our colleagues. So you are all my colleagues, you are all each other's colleagues. And so we want to make sure that we're talking about the same thing because before you got here, you might have learned about the self, but it may have been a different definition for what the self is. So, for example, in social psychology, we're always looking at how the individual is existing or interacting with a social context involving others, whether those others are real or imagined. So, this is a very fast paced, very dynamic version of the self that we're working with. We're looking at how the self works as a mechanism to build our identity. We're looking at how the self has been activated in a context to shape our behavior. We're looking at how the self might influence salience and attention to shape someone's perception differently from someone else. So the self is a very alive thing in social psychology. It almost has a life of its own. It's both active and reactive. So that is the approach within social psychology. Now, within other fields like individual differences, when they're looking at the self, they're looking at particular micro components that might feed into someone's sense of self or the self. So, for example, looking at aspects of personality or traits or abilities, like someone is very agreeable or someone is very neurotic, that can tell you something about the composition of someone's self, maybe, or elements that you would expect to feature in their express self in certain ways. But individual differences is not concerned with the activation portion of those things. It's more concerned with defining those specific components and labeling them so that other areas of psychology can work with them more dynamically. And then, of course, there's human development, which is both social and um, specific in an individual difference type of way, but it looks more at the consistency or the change over the lifespan. So human development is all about exactly what it sounds like, development. Some psychologists are focused in on the childhood years or the adolescent years or the older age years. Some look across the lifespan. And depending on where you sit and which areas you work in, you might see these individual differences, aspects of the self looking a bit different. Like children tend to have certain traits in their personalities compared to adolescents or adults, or across the lifespan, that same trait might change. So it's looking like longitudinally, developmentally linked. social psychologists, I hope you can start to see the difference. We're looking at the mechanism here. We're looking at what is the formula of the self and when does it become relevant and when does it interact with behavior and how does it shape change in society. So we're looking at social context, very active and very, very much alive in society. So this is important to think of in this course in particular when we begin trying to understand and define really abstract concepts to get at the core of what is social psychology. So the self is one of these concepts where it can get very broad very quickly, and there's a lot of terms underneath this term of the self that sound very similar but refer to very specific different things. So I'm going to walk you through today what are these terms that we use in social psychology, where do they sit within the hierarchy of trying to understand the self? And then what do they allow us to learn about ourselves as social animals in a different contexts? So if the self is our overall concept, we're going to step one step into that concept and get to something that's slightly more specific, which is sense of self. So, sense of self is basically where our perceptions and our behavior are influenced in a social context. So, this is shaped by a lot of different types of the self working together, and we'll see what that looks like in a moment. Um, but it becomes relevant in different social contexts. The limitation here for our conversation is that psychology and research is a bit behind in giving you very concrete boundaries for what the self is or what the sense of self. It's a very poorly defined concept. We know kind of what we're talking about when we talk about sense of self, but there's no specific definition that is universally used across psychology or even within the same field of psychology. So we'll continue to look at our sense of self through the lens of some of the vocabulary that we're about to use. Just keep in mind that the purpose of going through this vocabulary is not for the sake of just introducing new key terms into your vocabulary. It's not just for the sake of more words, but it's so that you can see the different mechanisms that are interacting together, and I'm giving you the names for the different mechanisms as well. So before I can teach you these mechanisms, I need to talk to you a bit about what a construct is. And we've kind of already begun to explore this idea of a construct. So the very formal definition is that a construct operationalize very abstract ideas by giving them concrete boundaries that you can identify, that you can observe, and know these things put together equal a certain construct. So, for example, if you were to walk into a classroom or an exam hall, let's say on an exam day, you see a student sitting at the desk, and just through a quick glance, you notice, first of all, that you're in the exam hall. You know this. You know an exam is about to take place. You see this student, you assume it's a student because they're sitting at a desk and they've got their pencils ready and their calculator or something. They've got their water bottle without the label, maybe. They look kind of nervous. Maybe they're fidgeting. Maybe they look really prepared, or maybe they don't look really prepared at all. But whatever you're catching through your senses, as we talked about last week, is feeding in information to you to shape your perception that this person might be experiencing test anxiety. Even if that's just a fleeting thought, a quick moment across your mind, it's probably past all these components together equal, this person is probably experiencing test anxiety. So the conclusion you came to is an inference. We talked about inferences last week. It's a conclusion you made based on limited information. Just what you've collected through your senses is your information. But test anxiety is a construct. So there are components that equal manifestations of test anxiety, and you know this construct of test anxiety, so you were able to identify it in the real world. We see this all the time in different fields, so I've given you a very specific definition for a construct here, but good examples that can help you understand what it is such as like temperature and gravity. These are all numbers that are measured with tools that we interpret as meaning something larger than the numbers on those tools. So for example, temperature like hot or cold, these are constructs of a certain degree based on even your personal preference in relation to your personal preference. So it's how we operationalize or create a framework for complex ideas when we want to research them or do something with them. So we need to take this weird thing that we've observed in society. There's an effect that we've noticed. We need to start giving that effect words and we need to start describing it. Once you've managed to accurately describe and capture that thing that you've noticed in society, you've got a construct. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today are constructs. Sense of self is a construct composed of other constructs. So this can get really abstract really quickly, but I'll try to keep you rooted with good examples. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to ask. So there are three central ideas about the self and how psychologists research them. The first is self-knowledge. This is our awareness about ourselves, aspects about ourselves that are usually based in fact. I went to this high school. I go to this university. I like this food. I don't like that color. So these are things that we know about ourselves, or at least things we think we know. And I say they're usually tied to fact because if we can link particular lived experience, which at least in our perception serves as fact, we come to interpret these things that we've lived and experienced as manifestations of our preferences. And when we have that sense of, oh, I like orange because when I put on this orange sweater, I feel really good about myself, or I'm happy with the outfit I chose. You might like orange. You might have a sense that that's your favorite color, but maybe it's because there's another color out there that you would like better, but you've never seen it before, or you forgot about that color. So this is why I say self-knowledge is based on facts, kind of. It's based on what you perceive to be the facts at that moment about yourself. Then there's the self-concept. This is how we know who we are. This one is a bit harder to grasp until we get to the part where I'm going to explain that specifically to you. So just keep that in mind. The self-concept is not as complicated as it sounds. And then we have self-esteem and self-serving bias. So these mechanisms work together to form your sense of self. Now, self-esteem and self-serving bias, we're not going to cover in depth in this lecture because it's covered really well in your textbooks. And we come back to self-esteem in another lecture, and we talk about self-serving bias in another lecture as well separately. So we will talk about these things and then link it back to what we've learned today about the self. But it's more important for me to establish some knowledge which might not be as clearly established in the textbook, or which I think needs a bit more attention concerning the first two of self-knowledge and the self-concept. One nice way to think of the self-concept and sense of self is to have a look at this image here on the screen on the right. Just take a moment and look at that image and consider what you're seeing. So if you're looking at the image, you might be thinking, right, I'm looking at stamps or a stamp. Or maybe you're thinking there's an icon of an airplane, there's the number 20, there's the color red, there's the color blue. They all have really nice cut borders. There are so many of them. They're really nice bits of paper. Yes, all of those things are true. And in terms of thinking of constructs sitting within constructs, let me show you an example of what the self-concept is. So before you are little bits of paper cut into squares. On top of them, we add color and ink and words and symbols to communicate certain things about this piece of paper. Okay, so this is the self-knowledge. We know that this piece of paper is comprised of color, words, paper, ink, materials. You can get really specific if you like. But overall, when it's put all together, it's a stamp. So the construct of a stamp allows you to look at this paper or this image, sorry, and see this pile of paper and know that these are stamps if you've seen a stamp before and you know what a stamp is. So the stamp is the construct here. And of course, you can say, I mean, you can't really say ink is a construct unless you're very philosophical about it. You could, I suppose, pick up on some of the micro bits of what we're talking about, like the symbol of the airplane. It's a construct of an airplane. It's not a physical airplane on the paper. But this is what the self-concept is like. The self-concept is like the stamp, the sum of the parts. And we'll talk about that a bit later. So after the lecture, I would say come back to the stamp example. And if you've not really understood how this links to the self now, that's totally fine. But let's sort of gauge our learning by coming back to this image at the end and seeing if the example lands well with you now that you understand the self knowledge and self concept better. So we're going to do a lot of today's session through introspection, as I said at the beginning. So before we continue on, I'd like everyone to take a moment to pause and think about how you introduce yourself. So if we were in the lecture hall today, I was going to have everyone to turn to their neighbor either on the left or the right and introduce themselves. So everyone just imagine you're in the lecture hall. You're sitting beside your colleagues, other students. Maybe you know them, maybe you don't. Pause and think about the scenario where I've asked you to turn to your neighbor and introduce yourself. How does that go? Maybe you turn to your neighbor and you immediately extend a hand forward to shake a hand and you state your name. Or maybe you look at your neighbor and you wait for them to make the first introductory move and then you just repeat whatever it is that they provide you. So, whatever it is, you've got a knee-jerk initial reaction to how you're going to introduce yourself. So what is the information that's coming to the top of your mind to share with another individual in this social context? Now consider if I would have asked you to stand up in front of the whole lecture theater and introduce yourself to the class. How would that have changed your behavior? How would that have changed the information that you share? How would that have changed the way you share that information? So maybe now, as you stand up in front of the class, you're not extending a hand forward to shake someone's hand. Maybe you're waving. So your behavior is a bit different. Maybe you share the same information. My name is, my favorite things are, I'm taking this class because maybe these are things that you would have said to your neighbor. Or maybe you don't really like being the center of attention. You don't really want to stay in front of the whole class talking. So you just get up, you maybe give a wave, you say your name, hi, my name is, and you sit back down because technically you've achieved the goal of an introduction. This is a really good example to see how our behavior is changing based on social context and how what we think about ourselves, the value of importance for communication is changing based on social context, based on who's around us, based on our different feelings about all the things around us or the amount of things around us, such as other people, and even the pressure of previous lived experience. Maybe you have a good history with public speaking or a bad history with public speaking, and maybe that's shaping your behavior. It's definitely shaping your expression of self. So, on that note, I would like to point to this right now, everyone. I'm going to try and share this link in the chat to make your lives easier. But we're going to go over to this Padlet page. And what you're going to do is you're going to write down 6 sentences that start with I. You can write really whatever comes to mind, whatever you like. So, 6 sentences, all starting with I. Once you've put your 6 sentences up, please then go and find an image that you would like to share along with your statements or after your statements. So we'll take, let's say about 5 minutes until 4:40 to see how you go. Unless you guys do this much quicker, you can scan the QR code or let me try to put this in the chat right now. I'll stop sharing so that you have more command of the screen. Actually, no, I'll leave this up in case you are using a QR code, and I'll share this in the chat. So you're writing 6 sentences that start with I. And we've already got some responses. That's great. I'm just going to try and share my whole screen so that you can also maybe see what's going on here live as well. All right, so you should be able to see all of that. The chat has disappeared for me. No, it hasn't. If you have any questions, feel free to post in the chat. I'm not going to give any feedback at the moment, just to let you all go ahead and put your 6 phrases in without any influence from me. Let's give this a little bit of order. Okay, so we have a lot of images coming in, and if you're posting, please feel free to continue. I'm just going to kind of make some comments about what I see in the first instance, but feel free to keep going if you've not completed the whole activity. So I'm seeing a lot of, first of all, a lot of positivity across the board in terms of what people are choosing to reflect on. Of course, it's not all positive aspects of life, but as a whole, the response from this class today has been really, really like you're focusing on positive elements of good quality of life, which I find really interesting because I've done this activity many times with different classes, and there's never been such a positive lean or valence towards the response. So that's one thing I noticed as the outsider to the activity. I see a lot of I love, I see a lot of I am, I see a lot of I like. There is some I don't like. So there was a few I don'ts. I don't have a, I think someone said I don't have a cat. There's some I'm from. And then, of course, the I ams or the I haves are also about different elements of our identity, oftentimes. There's not too many I haves, which is interesting because in previous years, I usually get a lot of I haves. And the ones that are in our conversation today are I have a pet of some kind, which is a relationship. So I think that's quite interesting that that's coming up for us. In previous classes, I would get a lot of I have and then an object. I have a car. I have whatever the trendy item is at the time. I was brought up in between two cultures. That's an interesting sort of play on the start of I. I want to drink water. I also want to drink water. Lots of pets and animals, which I think is quite interesting. Why is the Teams message task giving me social anxiety? I don't know if that was meant for the activity, but if this activity triggered some social anxiety for you, that's also an interesting dynamic of implied presence of others. You're experiencing it live. So even though to some people, especially outside of psychology, they might think it's very abstract to think of the presence of implied others and how that might shape our behavior. But this is a great real world, very concrete example of the implied presence of others. We've got some bread, we've got some jokes, we have a lot of weather, nature, which is great, a GIF, more pets, food. Great. So that's great. So we will come back to this. Um, let me go back to sharing just the slides. If you're still posting, that's no problem. Feel free to keep going. But we will come back to this. So let me make that a little bit more specific. Sorry, my laptop is just waiting to crash hosting this Zoom call, but let's hope it doesn't. So we have expressed some things about ourselves in this activity. This is what my 20 statements might look like. I am Emily Marie, so I am name, I earned degree in field, maybe at institution. I have relationship, two dogs. We saw a lot of pets come up. I am nationality, but live in nation. So we see that part of identity coming through. I do this career thing with my time at this particular place, which you may know. And then here is an interest about myself. It also has pop culture connotations, which might be important to acknowledge, but it is linked to something very specific about myself. And so that is how I describe it. So here are some of the things I wrote about myself. You might consider how they were similar or different to what you chose to focus on. So for example, did you give your name? I did see one name, but in general, I did not see names. Some people talked about where they work or where they want to work, the things they want to do, but that actually wasn't a huge focus of the dialogue. People definitely shared about pets, so that's a similar important relationship in our society. I think that's a nice reflection. We had some people sharing nationality like me, people sharing reflections on Scotland because it's our mutual shared residential place, so it makes sense to share on the mutuals. And we had some stuff about interest, but actually not too much, maybe coming through in the pictures more. Um, but overall, I've still got the Padlet up and I'm just looking at the new stuff. Now there seems to be more interest coming out. So I think that that's really interesting to consider the similarities and differences. Me as someone who designs this course to reflect on the self, and you as someone who's learning about the self, you'll see that just as people, we've shared things that are really similar in terms of what category of information they fit into, but also some things that are different that are really probably just at the top of your mind about yourself, things that would readily come to mind if you had to share information about yourself in an icebreaker game or something like that. It's also interesting to consider how the things you were thinking of saying, or the things that you indeed did choose to say, changed the longer you had time to engage in the activity. So maybe there was one thing that you initially put out. Maybe as you were getting on the third or fourth I statement, maybe you were changing the way you were writing it. Maybe you said, I am, I am, I am, I have, I like. Maybe you went from something very specific about yourself to very broad. So this shows how the more that we engage with our sense of self, we can get very deep very quickly. It's important to, in this class, remember to come back out of it and consider what is that mechanism at play. So if you right away went into I am name, consider what social schema or scripts for interaction or expectations for this course, what is the mechanism that was driving you to give that response? So this task is known as the 20 statements test. It was developed actually in the 1950s, but it is still used in free association type research where researchers are interested in knowing what's at the top of people's minds. So an example I can give you is I did my postdoctoral researcher training at UCL where we did a project, like my postdoc was a project, interviewing girls who had survived natural disaster in Indonesia to try to figure out what sort of interventions the schools across Indonesia could run to help better support the resilient recovery of girls that had survived natural disaster. And the initial activity we did was a free association interview where we asked people, what does resilience look like to you? What does resilience look like in your community? So you see in the first question, what does resilience look like to you? That's quite a broad question. They can think of anything in terms of how they understand resilience as a concept. And then in the second question, um, what does resilience look like in your community? You're starting to ground this really abstract idea in something very specific. And now you can make comparisons between the idealized resilience and actual mechanisms of resilience. And for researchers, that's a nice way to see the gaps because you want to try to bring more of those real world gaps in line with the idealized resilience for the community where possible, or at least it will help you identify the need. And if you can't do the idealized resilience mechanism, you can do something similar. So we see that this activity of just saying what's at the top of our minds tells us a lot about ourselves. It also tells us what's salient, what's important, and maybe sometimes what's important is just the social pressure from others to be really clear and establish facts. So if you're someone who, when you introduce yourself, the first thing you say is your name and whatever other relevant information to your social context, that doesn't mean that you're uncreative or anything like that. It might mean that you prioritize clarity, good communication, perhaps even fitting in, depending on if it's a workplace setting or something like that. The things that came to our minds first to share about ourselves are also usually the first things that we kind of wonder about other people. So when we do games where we can see the salience of certain information to ourselves, that usually tells us we value this type of information or we value something about what we're finding salient. And in this particular context where we're talking about self-knowledge, the things that we think we know about ourselves, it's helpful to know that those are the same things that we judge other people on. So when we're making those inferences, these are the sorts of things that we're going to develop an opinion on or at least notice really quickly because it's the same things that we would mention about ourselves or that are important to us about ourselves. So some common themes, just to quickly summarize some of the key information that usually comes out of this, is that people usually name physical characteristics, so how they're different to others, or even sometimes how they're similar, but mostly how they're different. They name their group membership, so I am religion, I am nation, I am job, something like that, something that's a part of their social identity. And sometimes they name personality traits. I really enjoy this thing. I am introverted. I like to talk to people. I like to dance, like things that indicate underlying personality traits, even if they're not explicit. So, looking at the self in context, our sense of self varies depending on context. And we talked a lot about this last week when we talked about the different information that we process and how we might be affected by that. So, how it might change our literal thinking process. But now, in terms of how that thinking process manifests itself, so how does it shape our behavior in a certain setting, we're going to go through some examples to try to show you how the self is involved in that process, in the processing of the information, and then in the reaction or action that we take. So, for example, you may have a professional self at work. You may have a really organized sense of self when you're wearing your parent hat. You might have a really laid back type of element about yourself when you're with your friends. You might have a more reliant or less authoritative version of yourself that comes out when you engage with parents or guardians. And you might have a totally unique side of yourself that you engage with when you interact with siblings or old childhood friends or people that knew you in different phases of your life. So while we have many selves, they become activated or more important to us depending on the social context. The way that this is described in the literature is that these versions of ourself become accessible. So this would suggest that we're not always aware of all the versions of ourselves at any given time, but that they kind of rise to the surface or bubble to the surface based on the context, our senses, and the information we're processing. So it's almost like there's a need, and our processing will bring to the surface a collection of elements about ourselves that all together comprise a type of self, like a professional self or a parent self or something like that. And that combination of elements that's coming forward about ourselves, that's altogether a type of self. We can go even broader and say, well, then we collect different versions of self, the parent self, the sibling self, the child self, all of this together, and that would be our self concept. But again, not all of ourselves are available to us or at the top of our consciousness all the time. So there are versions of ourselves that we might never think about because it just doesn't come up in our day-to-day life. But once we're put back into a setting where it does become relevant, maybe you forgot you were as knowledgeable about something or as natural about something as you used to be, for example. So these can be shaped by our social identities. So as we go through the life course, we talked about this last week that we have more diverse life experience as we age, the most in childhood, and then somewhere in young adolescence, especially when you take this on as a goal about yourself. I want to be more experienced about the world or whatever. You develop your social identity. Usually at some point, the diversity of lived experience will kind of taper off or dwindle down unless it's part of your lifestyle. But all of these different activities, relationships, and things that we engage in throughout our life course build up our social identities. It builds up our different available selves and the components that can go into themselves. So you may have heard of people who do this sort of thing. Often it's spoken about in society as a negative thing. So you'll hear people say, oh, well, they act different around their friends or they act different around other people. While I'm sure that there are negative manifestations of this, on the whole, we as human beings, as social animals, we actually do this all the time. And most of the time, it's a very positive thing. It definitely is indicative of emotional intelligence and adaptability to different social contexts. Um, and actually, it has been linked very preliminarily, this is very early research, to factors that indicate positive mental health, like a better quality of life, maybe better comfort in variable scenarios, more openness to new experiences. So that's a personality feature, but one that's relevant here. So we see this sort of social chameleon effect that happens, and that's actually what it's called in social psychology. And it is a good thing, and we all do it all the time. Um, One way that this is described is as like putting on different masks depending on what social context you're in. And then we have the famous metaphor of then we come home, and home is where you take off all of the masks and you can just be yourself. But we also have many different ways to express ourselves in modern contexts that social psychology research is still trying to catch up on and make sense of. But we see it in ways that maybe aren't expected, such as right now we're in a video lecture, which we didn't expect to be in last week. But here I am delivering this lecture to you via video, and maybe right now yourself as a student is a little bit different than the version of the student self you have when you're in a lecture hall. So we've changed your proximity to others, your colleagues. We've changed your proximity to me and your even like visual availability to me, if I can make that a concept. So this is one good way to see ourself exists in context. So we are not the same person all of the time in every place with all the same people. We have different versions of ourselves that come up, even if it's just in slight ways. There's small adaptations that we're constantly making with those resources that we have available to us. And it also takes a toll on us. It's not without cost. This does take energy. And that's why, again, after having a busy day with different types of people interacting with different groups, even or in different places, like you've gone to work, you dealt with clients, then you've come to school and you've sat in your lecture, and then you go home and you've got your flatmates, and then you go to your room and you close the door and you're exhausted, not because you did a lot of physical labor, but just you've gone through a lot mentally and you just need to decompress. So this is maybe one of those mechanisms that's occurring in the background. Self-expression also we see is relevant to the self in context. And I share this with you in particular, even though this is covered in your textbook, because there's a key takeaway here that I'd like you to have in learning in this course, and it's that self-expression is cathartic. Sometimes it puts us in a vulnerable space, but overall, if we're able to do it well, if we're able to do it in a way that's appropriate with our needs, it can help us release some of the tension that we may be experiencing, or even like negatively charged emotion, anger, frustration, that type of stuff, and bring in some relief and positivity. And this can be seen in all sorts of different formats, such as, how you create your social media profile, how do you describe yourself on there, physically, how do you dress yourself, if that's a conscious activity, if you're doing it with the purpose of self-expression. Do you have tattoos as like for permanent forms of self-expression? Do you have maybe body jewelry? How do you change these things depending on social context? So if you're going to a formal dinner, are you going to look and speak and act and think differently than if you're going out with friends for a night versus if you're coming to a lecture or something like that? So how is the physical environment impacting the social mechanisms happening? How is the social environment that exists within that physical environment changing your self-expression? So this is something that's very close to us, very internal, but is very much impacted by external factors. So thinking about those 20 statements that we asked earlier, the task was, think about how you introduce yourself. We did that first. And then we wrote down 6 sentences starting with I. And then after you've considered some salient things about yourself, we've gone and shared an image. So looking at the images that we've shared, I will newly share the split screen. I think that should be the whole screen. Just let me know if you can't see the Padlet. You should be able to. Let's consider something about the images that we've shared. So looking through a researcher lens at these images that we're sharing, we see we've got pictures of pets. Well, this is given context because the person has said, I have a bird and a cat. It might have just been a picture of a random bird. We've got a cat. I love cats. I'm going to infer that this is maybe that person's cat or a cat that they spend time with. Other images, so again, pets. This one looks like a stock photo of a cat. It might be the cat that someone personally spends time with, but we've got something about animals, relationships, pets, the open road. This could be a picture of Scotland, and so it's an ode to the nation that they live in, or it could just be the idea of a journey, so we can get really abstract. Then we've got some humor coming into the photos. So this is telling us another layer about this person who chose this photo. We've got maybe self-taken photos, accomplishment, interest related photos, humor type of going against the social grain photos, ruffling feathers, maybe a little bit type of tone in the humor. We've got some weather, which is really relevant right now with these storms. We've got a GIF, which is an interesting one. Don't know where it sits in terms of photos, but it does technically meet the criteria. But we see this person has chosen to take technologically oriented route, a humor related route. So maybe these are the things that are important to them. We see important social issues coming up, maybe work-life balance, big moments in a person's life. So we're seeing a lot of images come up. The deeper we get into the activity, the longer the activity time has been going on, the longer time has been going on in the activity. There we go. We see that the images kind of increased in communicating importance or life events, things like this. So these sorts of activities can tell us a lot about ourselves. They can say our interests, they can tell us about our life narrative, they can tell us or others who we think we are, how we might see ourselves, how we might see certain others, especially if this is in a more controlled scenario. So as researchers, these are the types of activities that you might want to do with people to gauge information about the individual. So if you're doing a dissertation on identity or the self or something, you might want to do a free association activity like this because you can learn a lot about what people value, what they believe, what they think about themselves and the world, and all of these different things. And all you need to do is give them a prompt. So we're right at 5 o'clock. So we're going to take let's say a 10-minute break because that was quite a lot. I'll say, take the full 10 minutes, have a look at the Padlet. We'll come back and we'll talk about self-concept. So the combination of selves equals a whole product, and that is the self-concept, but we'll get into it in a minute. I'll stop here. I'll switch myself off so you have full control of your devices, and I'll come back at 5:10. Okay. So the question that I got from one of our colleagues was basically saying the textbook tells me about this term of self-awareness and it explains it as a process. But what actually is self-awareness and is it this other process that they describe? So we're going to talk about different types of the self, some different manifestations of the self that come up. I hope that this gives you clarity if the textbook has been a bit confusing, but I want to define self-awareness because it's really abstract and it's not the most important concept that we're going to talk about. Self-awareness is basically just the physical state or the psychological state of being aware of yourself. So when you're reflecting on yourself in this class, when we talk about the different types of self and you consider how does this manifest for me? What does this look like for me? That's a state of self-awareness. So that's what self-awareness is. And then the different types of self we're about to talk about now. So, considering self-concept, that's a key word that you should know. So earlier we talked about self-knowledge. It's all of the different facts that you accumulate about yourself in different ways, sometimes through life experience, sometimes through labels that have been given to you, or roles that have been passed down to you, or roles that you've stepped up into that you've chosen for yourself based on your interests or your passions. So we accumulate all this information about ourselves, our likes, our dislikes, who we are, what we're good at, what we think, what we can do, what our ability is, what our just general proclivities are based on maybe our personalities. And there's just things that we're good at socially and maybe not good at socially. So things also like that. All together, that's our self-knowledge. That's what we know about ourselves, or at least what we think we know about ourselves, because truth is a very subjective thing in social psychology. When we consider that a different combination of those things are activated in different social contexts or environments, we get those different types of self popping up. We have, for example, for myself, we have lecturer Emily, or researcher Emily, or daughter Emily, or parent Emily, or dog mom Emily. And I'm slightly different in all of these different versions of myself, and I have different priorities and different schedules and to-do lists and things like that based on those different selves. When you consider the grand collection that Emily is all of these selves together, that is my self concept. So we see these images in front of us here. We see this fish, that's a collection of other fish, and all of these little fish are different versions of the larger fish's self, and all together it's a self concept. And the same for the puzzle pieces within the person. There's many different versions of that person's self that will manifest in different contexts based on different criteria and salience. So again, it doesn't just come from us activating different things. It comes also from our environment through our senses, telling us what's important in this moment, in this environment. And altogether, the available selves to us, or the available components, are our self-concept. So it is essentially the collective answer to who are you? And you might be more than one thing. And in fact, most people are more than one thing. I know a lot of teenagers struggle with trying to fit in and trying to find categories or boxes that they can place themselves in and find comfort. And, sometimes labels can help us do these sorts of things. Sometimes words can help us describe a part of ourselves that makes us feel more comfortable, that helps us communicate this thing with other people. I have an expectation that I fit into this box. So can you, please respect that expectation. So we have different things that we do to try and find harmony between our self-concept, the components of our self-concept. But all of it is motivated by different factors given your life experience, the environment that you're in. And I know a lot of this is starting to sound repetitive to you by this point. We are talking about different focal points though. So we're talking about identity and the self today. And last week we were talking more about resources and schemas and processing information. There is a lot of repetition in terms of the things we're interested in because this is social psychology. We have some boundaries. But I hope you can start to see how all of these things also work together. So the point of studying self-concept, the point of studying self-knowledge is so that at the end of the course, you can take a step back and you have learned something fundamental about human social functioning that you didn't understand before, that you can see through the lens of a social psychologist, that you can think like a psychologist. So that's why we continue to think of similar examples, but with slightly different point of views to help teach you. One really common, I guess, pop culture element that's consumed by the masses is Alice in Wonderland. So I like to use this example because you've probably seen the story or watched the movie or read the book or something. And it does something, it serves us well in this course to learn self-concept. So in Alice in Wonderland, there is Alice who falls down a rabbit hole and goes to Wonderland. And maybe this is a metaphor for a dream state or whatever. We're not getting into sort of media studies. We're just following the story. So Alice goes into Wonderland and she comes across this caterpillar who's saying, you know, like, who are you? You are Alice, but you're not the right Alice. And then while she's there, this happens a lot. People keep telling her, like, oh, you're Alice, but you're not the right Alice. And so there's this idea of a wrong Alice or a right Alice or multiple Alices within this one person. And this is a really interesting example to come to when we think of self-concept because Alice herself, as the person, she's the right person. She's the wrong version of the self. They need her to maybe be more capable, more confident. They need her to have pieces of knowledge that she currently doesn't have. So her self-knowledge limits her in her point of view. She says, what do you mean I'm the wrong Alice? I'm Alice. Who else is Alice? I am the right Alice. And everyone around her is aware that there's a different version of her that they're waiting for, that they're looking for, or that they'll help cultivate. So they keep telling her, yeah, you may be Alice, but you're the wrong Alice because they want a different version of herself to come through. So hopefully that has helped kind of clarify how those different selves can come up. And then together, her collection of the different Alices that she is her self-concept. So altogether, um, another way to describe it is as our cognitive representation of ourself, but a collection of the selves or of the different versions of the self is also fine. Like any cognitive representation, though, it has many different parts. So it's not just that we have categories in our mind of who we are. It's not quite that simple of a mechanism. There's different things working at the same time that are manifesting as a version of ourselves. So it leads us to commit certain behaviors or think in a certain way. But remember, we have all of these more subliminal processes going on, and one of those is the self schema. So the self schema is a concept that we have that's comprised of different beliefs about who we are. So we talked about schemas last week. It's that file folder, that mechanism that we use to refer to shape our behavior, our thought process. It's that quick reaction for information when you're looking for information about something. So we have self schemas that we can quickly draw upon when we're in a crunch and someone says, oh, can you introduce yourself to the room? You have your self schema that you can quickly find your file. Oh, this is me. This is my public face, maybe, or depending on who you are in that social scenario, you find your self folder and then you find your environment folder and you take out yourself in that environment and you can introduce yourself based on what you think is relevant. But it's also shaped by other abstract things like our values, the roles that we have in society, our goals, so what's important to us, our fears, so the things that can kind of put us in different mood states that can draw on those resources that we have. So the self schema encompasses all of those mechanisms. So everything working together to comprise that essentially sense of self. So I just summarized for you basically what a schema is. That's all that's here on the slide. And there's a nice example about going to the doctor. Everyone has a schema of what it might be like to go to a doctor, and this might look different for people that have different experiences, different levels of life experience, maybe in hospitals or with doctors or in different parts of the world. But let's say generally, if you wanted to go to a doctor here, the schema that we would have is you make an appointment if you can ever get through the receptionist to make an appointment, or maybe it's a walk-in situation only. You wait, you get called, you go into the room, you tell your problem or issue, they tell you some things back, maybe there's a question and answer. Usually you get some sort of resolution and you leave and so on. So that's the schema of a doctor. A doctor's appointment, just to quickly recap you on schemas further. But they also help us organize new information. Remember, we talked about last week about how our schemas can change, so they can adapt to be bigger to take on new information, or sometimes they break apart and they're like separate folders almost. They've become more micro. And so the same thing happens when we consider ourselves. We can break our self schema into different micro components as well, which maybe sit within the larger idea of who we are. But now we have, for example, not just our religion as something, but maybe we realize, oh, there was things I was doing that I thought were religious, but actually they're more cultural. So you've got a break in your religious schema now to have some of your behaviors are religious, some of them are cultural. Maybe you have some things in your cultural schema that are actually just things that you do in your family. They're not really like widespread for your ethnicity or for your nationality. So we've got another break in that schema, and you've got like culturally related familial things that you do and wider cultural things. So different mechanisms to store information, but as you become aware of distinctions like this about yourself, you will be probably shocked to see how deeply you can get into the analysis of an individual and actually how this can help you predict someone's behavior, predict your own behavior, predict outcomes in certain scenarios, just by being aware that we all have these different mechanisms at play and then furthering in your studies to learn how they work together. So that's the sort of thing we do in social psychology. When it comes to self schemas, the type of information we might have stored in there is probably going to be more about our own values, our beliefs, the things that give meaning to our life. So, such as the type of relationships we have with other people, the way that we value people and things in society. So, meaning is behind, I would say, all of the components, or at least most of the components that comprise our self schema. If there are elements that are part of your self schema that you feel like you've inherited, for example, looking at this person's self schema in the image, you've got future doctor, maybe that person doesn't want to go into medicine, but it's something their parents have always encouraged of them, and the parents have really supported them in this educational journey as best as they can. And maybe there's a sense of duty or responsibility that makes them have future doctor as part of their self schema. So you see, it's not a personally like a personal motivation of the individual per se. It's kind of inherited, but nonetheless, it's important to them because their parents are important to them. They want to make their parents happy. Therefore, this thing is part of their self schema. So the self schema is organizing all of this complex information about ourselves, about our lives, and boiling it down to how we see ourselves. They definitely affect salience. So again, thinking about the lesson from last week, we talked about salience. The things that are most salient to us are that which is dangerous, surprising, that which introduces risk, and also that which is new. And so when we have preferences for certain things or certain biases, what can be dangerous, new, interesting, etc., is subjective to each individual, largely based on your self schema. A great example of this is the self-reference effect, and this is the tendency to process information that's related to ourselves more efficiently than we would process information related to nothing to do with ourselves. And we see this a lot in media, engagement with media. There's a lot to do with the role of media in our society that social psychology research is only just now starting to investigate. And this is one of those effects that we don't understand the whole implication of it, but we understand something is happening here. So, for example, if you are watching a TV show or a movie or something, and you are asked as part of an activity, let's say for this class, that for the next TV show you watch, I want you to compare yourself to the main characters. Pick the first 5 characters you see on the screen and compare yourselves. Going forward down the line, you are likely to remember having done this activity, and you're likely to remember the character that you focused on, or one of the examples from this activity is the character or person that had the most similarity to yourself. So when you recall that you did this activity and you recall you analyzed different characters, whoever seemed to be a lot like yourself is who you're going to remember. The same happens all the time when you just watch TV in other sorts of ways. When you notice that they eat the same things you do, would make the same decisions you would, have the same values as you seem to connect with the content a bit more, and you will remember the content of it a bit more. So it has cognitive implications, very tangible, measurable, objective cognitive implications. So this is the important part of the second bit. So all of that has kind of been a preface. I said I'm going to talk about the different types of self. And so this is really kind of important for you to grasp. So do feel free to ask questions. The important thing to know is that we have three selves. You can boil it down to three different types of self. There is the actual self, which is a construct that contains the information of who we believe we are or what we know of ourselves. So our self schema would largely feed into this perception of who we believe we are, because the self schema is mostly based on what we think are facts. So we think there's a really good chance, there's a high probability that our actual self is actually who we're reflecting out into the world. I would say I challenge the use of the word actual here, because really what it is, it's our perceived actual self. Again, in social psychology, almost everything is quite subjective to the observer. So it's who we think we are. It's not necessarily indicating an objective who we are, because I don't even think that's possible. But the idea here, it's who we think we are. So we continue to gain knowledge about ourselves. If you remember, I said last week that our friends know us best, better than we know ourselves, and our family knows us second best. But these outsiders know us better than ourselves because they have a different perspective towards our behaviors, especially over time. And we draw upon how we're reflected in the perceptions of others to really learn about ourselves, particularly when people see us in ways we wouldn't see ourselves. We tend to remember the negative perceptions in a way that's more overemphasized than the positive ones, which is quite unfortunate, but it's just a bias. It's salient information, right? It's a bit threatening. It makes us uncomfortable. And maybe it's potentially dangerous because it indicates you might have conflict in a relationship with someone. So there's many things that make that salient to us. So just in terms of like mental health messaging, give some weight to also the positive perceptions other people have about yourself when you're constructing your actual self. But that's how we build it. Cultural differences can feature in here as well, in terms of how much weight you give to outsider perceptions about you versus what you believe about yourself. So for example, if you have an interaction and someone kind of says that you're selfish in that decision that you made or that behavior that you did, maybe you feel confident in your reasoning for why you did that thing or said that thing or whatever. So you don't let that label of selfish or self of selfish interact with your actual self. You kind of reject that as, no, that's a miscalculation on that person's part, and you leave it out. Whereas if you're from more of a collectivist culture versus an individualist, which would be the first example, collectivist cultures tend to give at least equal weight to the people around them in terms of information pulling into the actual self. So for example, if it's a parent or a sibling or a really close childhood friend that says, oh, that thing you did was selfish, we those cultures tend to give more weight to the outsider because, one, they value the outsider's perception a bit more, but two, they have more trust that the individual is reflecting something that's more objective and actual, that they may not be speaking out of a place of miscalculation, such as emotion or something like that. So the key takeaway here is that the first version of self that we're going to talk about is the actual self. The actual self is who we believe we are. The second type of self, and this is a really interesting one to me, is the ideal self. This is who we would like to be. Sometimes it can be an actual person if you have a particular role model. For example, children really often grow up and say, I want to be just like my mom, my dad, my guardian, my friend, that celebrity, this athlete. Children tend to have those sorts of ideal selves, but it can also be the product of a schema of desires. So maybe it's not a real person, but there's a collection of things that you wish you had in your life, or a collection of ways that you wish you would behave or want to behave. And maybe you're actually doing some things to make that true about yourself. Maybe you're not, it doesn't matter. But this imagined state of a better version of yourself, whatever that might look like, whatever better is to you, that's your ideal self. So the things that you might be trying to change about yourself, to maybe improve quality of life, to have more positive outcomes, maybe to get more admiration and social cohesion from others. The important thing to know about the ideal self is that this is a process that happens through social comparison. So even when we might not think it is, that is one of the key mechanisms behind the ideal self. And some social psychologists would argue it is the only mechanism behind the ideal self. So, for example, we see that influencer on the jet from last week, and she looks like she has the perfect life. She's on vacation and she's got great hair and new clothes and she looks happy and not stressed and she has time to take a photo on a private jet and post it to her social media where she gets all of these hundreds of thousands of likes. A lot about that interaction can feed into our ideal self. Even if the ideal self is changing moment to moment, hour to hour, week to week, there are those things that we have that consistently we want to be better, do better at whatever. So there are consistent elements of the ideal self, but there are also things that are really easily influenced moment to moment, depending on who we're talking to or what we're doing. You might notice this if you have one of those I guess I would say problems. I have this problem where you like to pick up hobbies, but then maybe you try that hobby and it's either too much stuff, too much time, you're not very good at it, you don't have time to learn it very well, and then you just kind of give up. But then, hey, you found a new hobby and this is going to make you so much happier and you're going to learn this cool skill and maybe you can quit your job and do this hobby and sell it and make money. So we really quickly fall down this rabbit hole of the ideal self. So keeping in mind, there is a version of ourself which is ideal. It is imagined. It is the product of all of the things we desire, and that is stemming from social interaction and relationships, both real and imagined. Then there is the ought self. So this one is often confused with the ideal self, but it's different. The ought self is who we would like to be still, but it comes from a different place than the ideal self. The ideal self, the previous one, is based on all the positive things that we might have in our life if we did these changes or made these changes, or the things that would make our life better or who we are better. The ought self is a product of who we think we ought to be, usually due to some sort of pressure, whether it's social pressure from individuals in certain roles, like your parents or your boss, or maybe it's pressure coming from a large group association, like your religion or your political group that you're affiliated with, or just a group that you're really visibly a part of. So this is kind of more emotionally linked type of self. So this is how we perceive we should be. Like maybe we think we should be more responsible, or maybe we think we need to be more ethical in how we interact with certain people. We have a sense of obligation to do certain tasks, and we feel we should be more grateful. So it's all about who we think we should be. Now, usually this is driven from a place of avoiding negative criticism. Like, for example, we don't want to be selfish, even if we think we can be sometimes, because in society, people don't like selfish people, and we want to be liked, and so we want to avoid being selfish. That's one route to the ought self. But I think that this narrative of the ought self coming from a negative place is a product of most social psychology research being done in weird samples because we don't know too much about how the ought self manifests in Eastern cultures, other than the sense of wanting to avoid negative outcomes like criticism, for example. However, I think that there are a lot of positive mechanisms that feed into the ought self, particularly in collectivist cultures, that are not really talked about in the literature, but I think that they do exist and work, such as a sense of like wanting to bring honor to the collective, a sense of positive responsibility where you're not trying to avoid a negative outcome, but what's motivating you is a positive thing, a desire to bring about respect for your parents, or a desire to bring about satisfaction in your community. So I think that there are also positive things that can feed into the ought self. We just have not documented them as extensively in the literature as some of the more negatively balanced things. Now, self-discrepancy theory does a really good job in laying out in front of us how the different selves are interacting. And this is where we begin to tie in mental health with the self. So, self-discrepancy theory basically says that there can be a dissonance that happens when your actual self and your other selves, particularly the idealized self, are at odds with each other. So there's some sort of conflict or misalignment, and it's creating a dissonance in ourselves. Dissonance is a key word. Hint, hint. Dissonance is a key term I would spend some time getting familiar with, particularly cognitive dissonance. And what it means is it basically refers to the state of tension that we are driven to relieve in the same way that we are driven to eat when we're hungry or drink when we're thirsty. So these are like innate drives, and resolving dissonance is a cognitive element of lived experience, but it is a cognitive need that we have to relieve in whatever way that we can. So when our actual self, who we think we are, is at odds with our idealized self, who we would like to be, this can affect us in many different ways, but it definitely creates a dissonance that has to be resolved. Now, usually it's resolved in one of two ways. You think about who you are, you realize you can be better at this particular thing. Like, for example, maybe you wish you were more physically active and more sensitive to your health, like that you ate better and you were just a healthier person. You don't really think you're very healthy right now, but you really would like to be healthier and in better shape and things like this. So you have a bit of a tension in yourself, a bit of a discomfort. Now, you can either change your behaviors and start changing your goals and actually make those changes in your life to bring your actual self in more alignment with the ideal self. That's one thing to do. Or maybe you don't make that change, and what you actually need to do is tweak your ideal self. Maybe your ideal self is so far out of the realm of reality, or you've just put the benchmark so high for yourself that it's not actually possible. Like maybe you think, oh, it would be so great if I had a really respectable job because then people in society will treat me better. I know I want to be a pilot. A pilot is a really respectable job. And it would be so great if I could be that now or like in the next 5 years. Well, first of all, you're in the middle of a psychology degree in Edinburgh, not in whatever training program you need to be a pilot in the 5 years. So if that is bringing you tension in your life, maybe you need to adjust your ideal self a bit to come more in line with what you can tangibly achieve with the resources available to you and in consideration of any challenges or obstacles that you might face on the road to becoming the ideal self. Not to say you couldn't leave this program and become a pilot, just saying make sure that your ideal self boundaries are within grasp, that they're not too far out of your realm of reality. Otherwise, you're going to be left with this tension that you cannot resolve any way other than downward spiraling. And then you get sort of sucked into a lot of the negative mental health, I would say bubbles like anxiety and depression can often be linked to this self discrepancy that people can experience. When we do this well, when we are able to continuously ride this wave that we experience moment to moment of our actual self being clashing with idealized self. And social media is always putting in our face different things that we should incorporate into our ideal self. Be sweeter and calmer. Maybe this is particular towards women, this example right now. You know, society will say, oh, be polite and be kind, but also be empowered and make your own money and I don't know, do all of these things and have all of these friends, but also spend time by yourself and make sure that you're in good shape, but also eat to your heart's content because you only live once. And so your ideal self is constantly being shaped by social media as well. So we're constantly having to fight this battle. But when we do this well, when we're able to maintain a state of homeostasis, that's the opposite of dissonance, we call this self-regulation or good self-regulation. So we think about this often with children. When children have a big emotion that they have a tantrum because they can't regulate out of that emotion, it's the same kind of process that's happening, except the subject here that's influencing that wave that we experience is ourselves clashing in a dissonant state. That was a lot about the self, and I hope that that made some sense. And I hope that this example can help kind of drive this home. Um, representation in media might be a really abstract concept to some people, but when you start to study the self, you can quickly become aware why certain things in society are more important, such as representation. So, for example, if you are from a group, a culture, an ethnicity, something socially linked, but also maybe tied to elements of yourself that you couldn't change or wouldn't change, definitely wouldn't change, such as visible ethnicity. And you live in a world where all of the visible ethnicities that are constantly shown to you in a very positive light are very different from this thing about yourself, which you couldn't change even if you wanted to. It's almost like dissonance is being ingrained in society on a mass scale in this scenario. And up until very recently, and some would argue even still today, that that is the case. That, for example, there is a lot of like BIPOC cultures that have stories depicted in media that would be relevant for that community, but don't have people that look like them or think like them or behave like them featured in the media. So what happens is when people then watch this media from those groups and they're not seeing themselves represented, this can clash with their idealized self, especially when in media everything is romanticized and over communicated and shown in very well manicured lights. And this can interact with an individual's idealized self. And then you shut off the movie or the TV show, you close this thing about this perfect person with the perfect life and this really cool thing that happened to them. And you're left in the room with your actual self. And this can be a very hard come down to something that should have been a positive engagement with art, but actually has left you feeling a little bit drained and maybe not in a very good place because now you're experiencing dissonance. So, this is one way social psychologists can go out in the world and contribute to positive social change, such as by studying things like this and getting involved in policy or activism or continuing to study social psychological elements. There is a poem that I want to play, but I'm not sure if I'll have enough time, so I think I'll just talk you through it and I will link it up on the Learn page. It wasn't up previously because I was going to play it now, but it's a 7-minute video roughly that also kind of walks you through a bit of this individual's thought process about a really common lived experience that most of us will have, which is going to the hairdresser. And this is an individual that belongs to a very particular social group that is not well defined in society. And um, there are a lot of inferences made about this individual based on their visible social groups. So again, we're thinking about the formula and the mechanisms here behind this person. I can simply say to you, they are a non-binary poet that works in Glasgow, and they've put this video together about their experience getting a haircut. That is the lay summary of the video, but the scientific summary would be looking at the different mechanisms at play. There are social groups here, there are labels here, there's inferences happening between the individual and society to the individual. There's a motivation here that this poet has felt the need to find a platform to express something, probably to engage in that process of self-expression, which I told you is cathartic. So it helps relieve tension and dissonance. So it's a therapeutic mechanism to engage in for this person. But also it's helping them clarify their self-concept, perhaps breaking apart some of their self-schemas into a more helpful way. So when you go away today from the lecture, if you have time, certainly before the next lecture, give this video a watch and just let them walk you through their thought process around getting a haircut. I will give you the disclaimer that the language is a bit strong more towards the end, so just be mindful of that if that's not really your comfort zone. When you watch that video, you're going to see that the individual's sex is the main theme of the poem. I would say it's not the whole focus of the poem. The poem is more of a point of view experience of a haircut. So when you go through it, come back and just see how I've added some notes here to consider how assumptions, even when we think we're kind of controlling narratives or controlling our own perceptions, assumptions are always slipping in there. Schemas are always dictating a lot of our processing and a lot of our thinking. So have a watch of the video at some point before the next lecture. Come back and have a look at these notes. And hopefully that will help solidify a real world example of how all these processes are working. Okay, so we've reached the end of block two. I'm going to talk to you a bit about identity. Let's take a 5 minute break and then we'll talk a bit about identity. So we'll come back at 5:50. Hello, everyone. All right, let's come back to the session. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment and just answer some of the questions in the chat because they're really good and I'm hoping can help me teach you some of these really abstract concepts. So the first question that I wanted to answer is the one that asks, how is a schema of visiting a doctor different from a construct of visiting a doctor? Really, really good question. So the schema are completely dependent on who we are as individuals. So schemas are quite subjective. They are frameworks of knowledge that we develop ourselves over our life course based on our life experience. It may be developed through the lens of your culture, through the lens of what you believe, but it's kind of information you've collected about different social environments, objects, people, places, things, but you've developed this knowledge over the course of your life through life experience. So that's a key component that it's linked to your life experience. A construct is different in that usually they exist in scientific settings. It's a term or a label given to a series of components so that we can communicate about that thing. So for example, the construct of an attitude, so attitude is a construct. Attitude is a word created by scientists to be able to talk about when someone has an attitude about something. And what we know in this course, because we learned it last week, is that an attitude comprises of a feeling about a thing, a person, place, or thing, a behavior related to that person, place, or thing, and how we think about that person, place, or thing. I've said a feeling, a behavior, but it's more general. It's like our feelings towards that thing, our behaviors towards that thing, and our beliefs about that thing or how we think about it. So we know that when you add them all together, it equals someone's attitude about that thing because scientists have given us this construct that an attitude equals A plus B plus C. So we can both talk about attitudes, and we're not talking about your subjective attitude or my subjective attitude, but we're talking about the construct of an attitude. Whereas your schemas might be developed through your attitudes. So this is kind of a roundabout way to use attitudes here, but your schema of an attitude, you might not really have one because maybe you've just learned this concept and you haven't actually applied it anywhere yet. So maybe in your dissertations, you'll work with attitudes and then you'll have some thoughts and feelings about that term. But it's not the term itself, if that makes sense. Attitude in itself is a scientific construct with a particular definition. So they're very different things. Like construct, you can say it exists in on paper. It exists in definitions. It exists in the work that we create. The schema is an internal thinking process or mechanism. So that's the difference there. Another question that came up that was really good. I had to read the question twice, but I'll read it out to you and everyone can scroll to it if you need it a bit more broken down for you. But the question is, how do we distinguish the ideal self from the ought self when the ideal self is born from social comparison based on social norms that also inform who we should be, the ought self? So basically it's saying, well, what happens when the ideal self is a result of the processes that have comprised my ought self? Like what if they kind of look the same or they're coming away with the same indicators or features or mechanisms? So the ideal self in the literature, you will find that scientists talk about the ideal self with a view of how it drives a person in a motivation or with goal-oriented language. So someone's goal is to better their life or it's a desire that they have for one reason or another. And there's a whole literature on desires and why we desire things. But you can think of ideal self as desire, if you like, your schema of desires. So if you're moving in a particular direction, kind of due to the things that motivate you under the umbrella of desires. The ought self might contribute certain things to the ideal self, but it's not really composed of things that you desire necessarily. It's kind of the things that have been imposed on you, usually from external factors like relationships, roles, groups that you belong to. So, kind of other people or other situations have made this suggestion that has come to sit really deep down inside of you that you should be or ought to be a particular way, even if you don't really desire to be that way. So, although sometimes the ideal and the ought self can have similar features, the way that those things got there, it's coming from different places, if that makes sense. Um, I'm just rereading the question to make sure that I've answered it all. So based on social comparison, yes, social comparison, that's the mechanism with the ideal self. The ought self, it's not really social comparison. It's like other things like fear of rejection, perhaps, or um, a drive to get social approval or to help others get social approval. So there's all sorts of different things that can drive the ought self, a sense of morality or obligation, things like that. Whereas ideal self is purely desire. Can the ought self influence what manifests as the ideal self? Like, can these two versions of the self be linked? Yes. So I think I kind of answered that there. The ought self can definitely influence the ideal self, and I would say even the other way around. There was a question about why the culture chapter was linked to this week. So I've just briefly said to explain, and hopefully you'll come to see this towards the end of the lecture, which is kind of now. We're going to talk about identity. But culture is basically the foundation from which we all come into the world, and we are never existing in a time or place that doesn't have a culture. We are always even in the most isolated and remote places, well, then that's the culture of that place. So we constantly exist within an ecosystem of social expectation, relationships, things that we're doing, things that we have to do, things that people just do here, the way that people do things here. So we exist in some sort of social environment at all times. And so that's the point of the culture chapter here, to help teach you a bit more of the mechanisms of a culture. So what is a culture? How does it influence our thinking, our behavior, these things? So that you can see where when I say our thought process is shaped by our environment, when I make these statements that might seem abstract, if you know a bit about culture, then you will know when I say social environment, it's like culture that I'm talking about. It's the different culture in a room, the different culture in the building, in the city, in the country. So those are different layers for you to look at the different environments I talked to you about. It can also help us understand internal and external processes. So the things we believe, the things we value are largely ingrained in us through some culture exchange or culture exposure, as well as shaping the actual physical environment around us. Okay, let me see. Self-expression is presented as helpful for individual mental health, and I'm not doubting that's true, but isn't there also evidence that individualism, focus on self and self-expression, correlates with populations being less happy? Can those things be tallied, or is this question way too big a question? No, I think that's a great question, and that's exactly the type of thing, like these are the types of questions that we should be thinking of on a course like this. So I don't ever want you to take the information I present to you as unchallengeable, because the whole point of research is that we are all in dialogue with each other, and you are all my colleagues. As much as I am the lecturer teaching you things and you are students and you're learning, sure, that's the career stage that you're at, but you're all training through a research pathway. And so your voice as even junior researchers, it still carries weight. And so if you're having a clash of ideas between what you're learning and what you learn somewhere else, maybe such as right now in this question, absolutely raise that, clarify, learn more, because you're about to go into the field and be a researcher, and you want to be able to know how to talk to people about questions like this and how to answer them. So to answer the question, I'm not sure if there is more evident, like I'm not sure the particular evidence that exists to show that individualism and focus on the self correlates more with being less happy, then self-expression correlates with being happy. So I'm not sure in terms of comparing the effect one way or the other, which one is more likely to occur. I do know that there is a good history of evidence behind this idea that self-expression serves us positively in terms of mental health. Of course, there are many ways that self-expression can also take away from positive factors that are working in our mental health. So if we think about our mental health as it's the outcome of a lot of processes that are happening at any given moment, and depending on which processes are winning or are being affected in a certain way, we are in, let's just say, mood. We are in a good mood or we are in a bad mood, just to really simplify it. There are certain activities I can engage in through self-expression that will continue to bolster a positive mood. Like I will connect with my friends about the shared interest in the sports team, maybe, or something. That self-expression, that is also engaging with community, that social support network, that's engaging in my interests. Maybe also we're doing something physical, like we're actually watching the game, or we're sharing snacks or something. We've got favorite foods. There's a lot of mechanisms in play positively in this expression. There are different types of expressions that actually will serve to be more isolating or will encourage rumination or things that can trigger anxiety or put us in a more like depressive state or a more negative mood. So I would say self-expression is not always good. There is very few times you will ever find anything that looks like a universal truth in this course. There's always exceptions to the rules, and there are hardly ever rules to begin with. So yes, absolutely. Those things can have positive and negative valence. Depends what it looks like. It also depends on the personal subjectivity of the individual engaging in those behaviors. I hope that helped clarify. Um, can we say the ought self is externally motivated and ideal self is internally motivated? Good question. I would say at a surface level, to help you remember the distinction between the two, you could say that, but I wouldn't say that that's like a hard boundary because, for example, even the ought self, it completely depends on what you value and think is important as an individual. If you value your, let's say in this scenario, you value your religion, even if that religion is non-religion, you value the community around that belief, and that community tells you as a person you should be a certain way. You should challenge people who spread religious ideals, or you should listen to people who spread religious ideals with a compassionate ear. Different groups will tell you different things. How important that group is to you is completely subjective and internal at its core. So that is an internal motivation. So I wouldn't say these things are always as clear cut as internal, external, but on the surface, if it'll help you remember that those things are different, sure. But is that the whole truth? No. Does that mean the ought self change to ideal self when individuals desire to do that action? Good question. So again, I think it's coming from different places. I guess they can look the same, as I said earlier, but I don't think an ideal self will ever entirely look like an ought self. I would say for a person that has an actual self look like their ideal self, look like their ought self, that is the most happy and at peace person. For individuals that are more socially disciplined, is it that their ideal self will be more in line with the ought self compared to the defiant ones? I'm not sure what you mean about socially disciplined. I guess in terms of like they don't let themselves desire things based on influencers and media, like for example, something like that. I think that there's always an element of desire in our human experience. So the things that compose the ideal self might be different. Um, and perhaps they're more malleable or influenceable. Like if they change quickly, that's going to have an effect on a person. That's going to be more taxing to the resources available to us and maybe throw our moods in a bit more of a volatile state compared to someone who is able to manage their level of desire, or at least the objects of their desire, if they remain consistent over time. What's the difference between self-schema and self-knowledge? So self-schema sits within self-knowledge. It's one of the ways we develop self-knowledge. They're very similar. I would say you probably don't have to worry too much about the difference between those two things, but you can, like, self-schema sits within self-knowledge. It's in the slides, this distinction that I know. Can schemas, which are a collection of beliefs about who we are, be linked to prejudice towards other groups or groups? Yeah, absolutely. Or groups, sorry, I'll finish reading the question. Or groups that we are not a part of and don't understand. Absolutely. Our self-schema and our self-knowledge. So those mechanisms that work together, they're highly influenced by the information that we get through other people as well. And information that we get through other people will always be filtered through their own lens. So, who are they in how they acquired that opinion about you or that perception? And then they're going through some process and how they communicate it to you, but you're also going through some process and how you're listening to it. So, absolutely, prejudice, bias, these things are always at play, even if it's on a very, very micro scale. It's what makes the difference between every individual on the planet. Even when they do the same behaviors, it can be coming from totally different places. Um, Okay, and then there's a question about independent self as well. Okay, so I'll just sort of put a pin in this one. I think I've answered a few questions. I'll let you guys sit with that knowledge. I'm going to talk a bit about identity now to help you understand identity a little bit. We're going to deep dive into large group identity in the next lecture. So there's just some key things that I would like you to think about as we end today's lecture and prepare for next week's. So the things I want to talk to you about are listed on the slide, and the reason that part 3 doesn't have slides is because this is just going to be a discussion, and we'll deep dive into what the experience of these things are in our next session. So if we were in the lecture hall, I probably would have taken a seat at the front of the class and just sat and talked to you all and kind of opened the floor to questions about identity. I absolutely open the floor here. If you want to say or engage anything, feel free to, use the raise hand function or use the chat. But I'm just going to light touch preface the ideas about identity, plant some seeds, and then next week, these ideas will be familiar to you and we can go a bit deeper into them. So, identity is also a very quickly developing, quickly emerging area of psychology, not just social psychology, but across the board. And in terms of its implications on mental health, we know that they're deeply linked to each other. We know identity can influence mental health. Mental health can inversely influence aspects of our identity in terms of activating a sense of self and that being tied to an identity. But we don't know really very much about how that process happens or why we develop to have this, other than things that contribute to our social cohesion and survival in groups. So other than that, we don't really know too much about how it works. We only know that they're linked. What we do know about identity is the following. So we know identity is largely a product of the meaning making process that we go throughout our lives. So as you go throughout your life, you will have moments where you reflect on the story of your life. And from reflecting on the story, you will come to a place where you have updated your sense of self, you have consolidated a bunch of knowledge from your self-knowledge, and you have the sense of like, yes, this is who I am. So don't worry too much about self-schema, self-knowledge, identity, disentangling those words. Think of identity as like the overarching, who are you? So it encompasses self-concept, it encompasses self-knowledge, self-schema. It's much, much bigger than all of that. It's more about the relationship you have with the world. So individual to the world, and it can tell us also a lot about relationships between individual to individual. It works on all the levels, but for the discussion right now, we're thinking about identity broadly. We're thinking about identity in the sense of the word that you would probably think of if you and your friends were sitting around a table talking about identity in a non-formal setting. So just that sense of belonging, that sense of a group membership, maybe, that sense of I am the product of certain life experiences. So within each one of these things that's contributing to your identity, there's always that underlying process of meaning making. So everything that's comprised in your sense of identity, whatever that might be, and again, it might be something that becomes a little bit different based on what environment you're in or who you're around. But generally, identity is a bigger, more stable element than that. And that's all a product of the things that are important to you. It's shaped by your belief system. So, this is where culture really comes into play because it gives you the benchmark to weigh other things in. And of course, as you grow up and you move out of the home or you make new friends or you have new life experiences, your sense of identity, your benchmarks, your culture, all of that can change, but it's kind of a slow burn process. It's much more longitudinal than self schema, for example, which can be shaped moment to moment, or ideal self or ought self. That ought self is a bit more long term, but ideal self that can be shaped moment to moment. Identity is like the core fundamental sense of who you are. Important things to know about identity before next week. It's largely influenced by the large groups that we belong to. When I say large group, I mean your ethnicity, your nationality, religion or non-religion, like you say, philosophical worldview. It's linked to social groups that you might be a part of, whether that's related to sex and gender, whether it's related to world issues. We get a lot of our identity from large groups. And then, of course, within those groups, we build relationships with people and we have opinions about, how much that person aligns with the ethos of the larger group, how that makes us feel then about how we align with the ethos of the larger group. So we think a lot about large group identity when it comes to individual identity. Now, I want to introduce some concepts to you that will help you next week. The first is this concept of a prototype. So, within identity, let's just go off of country of where you were born. Okay. Let's say that's a factor that will feature into your identity, probably if you spent time there at all, or if your parents had some elements of that culture. So even if you moved away from the place that you were born and you went to a different place, if your parents kind of carried the spirit of the original place, you probably had a bit of that in your upbringing. So it would still be relevant in that case. So place you were born, let's think about that as a factor that has contributed to your identity. There is a large group of people who were also born in that place or from that place. So there's a large group that exists around that place. I will use myself as the example. Let's say Canada. Okay. My large group identity there is linked to Canadians. So there is a part of my identity that I don't really control that was kind of given to me through life circumstance that's linked to a large group, which is Canada/Canadians. Now, this idea of a prototype suggests that within every large group identity, there is this idea of the prototypical, perfect, most idealized representation of that large group identity. So I don't know what you all picture as the perfect or ideal Canadian, but there exists in your mind some idea, even if it's very, very vague. So for me, who belongs to this group, I probably have a much more specific, maybe more accurate idea of the prototype for a Canadian. Now, the prototype is at the idealized point. The best member of this group, the perfect Canadian, will embody the traits and characteristics of the prototype. Okay. So that's on one end of the spectrum of being the most Canadian. So being high identity thing would be exactly at the point of the prototype. On the other side of the spectrum is the person who is the furthest thing from that prototype, but still within the same group. So that can be someone who was born in Canada and moved away and had nothing to do with Canada, never even Googled it, has no knowledge, but technically because they were born there, they belong to that group or something like that. Okay, this is just an example. So now we've got a spectrum, an identity spectrum. On one side is the prototype, on the other side is the person that doesn't really belong but is just on the inside, so like a non-belonger. And who you are on the spectrum of your identity, like you will sit somewhere on that spectrum between the most that thing and the least that thing on each one of the factors of your identity. So in your ethnicity, you'll sit somewhere. In your philosophical worldview, you'll sit somewhere. And then we get into the axes that are also related to roles. There is a prototypical idealized version of a student, of a psychologist, of a I don't know, I'm blanking, of other factors, of an English speaker, of English second language speaker. You know, there's all of these different elements that feed into our identity, and we sit somewhere on the spectrum of from the most that thing to the least that thing, and the anchor is the prototype. Usually social groups will communicate to you what that prototypical person looks like. So for example, political groups are really good at telling you the ideal member of our group will believe in this and will do this and will stand up for these things. So with political groups and social groups, it's a little bit easier to identify. With ethnicity and things like that, it gets a little bit more vague because these things are changed over time, over generation and stuff like that. So they all exist within their own socio-historic context. Now, identity is a whole area of psychology that I could just talk to you about for hours and hours. But I think that you've got the key fundamentals that you need for next week, which is almost every factor about ourself exists on some sort of identity spectrum from the most that thing to the least that thing. Some factors external to us control the narrative around what is the ideal thing. So we're not deciding what the ideal thing is, but it's external. It's kind of given to us. As I said, political groups will tell you the best member of this group looks like this. Everyone in the group sits somewhere differently on the spectrum, and that's individuality. That's individual difference. Even if you all think that you're being as close to the prototype as you possibly can be, nobody can be the prototype because it's an idea. It doesn't actually exist. So you're all going to sit somewhere on the spectrum. Cognitive dissonance, we've talked about it today. It's that clashing of ideal and ought self, which comes into play when elements of your large group identity start to feature in, sorry, it's the clash between actual self and idealized or ought self. It could be also ought self. So when your large group identity has given you something that you've taken into your ideal self, and your actual self is clashing with it, and you've decided it's really important that I be that thing, but I'm not that thing, we now see cognitive dissonance coming into the field of identity. And as I said, the important thing about dissonance is not just that it happens, but that it's a drive. Like we are driven to resolve this in the same way we are driven to eat when we're hungry. So it's a very core fundamental element of our human existence. It is a core element of our processing as animals, as social animals. So it's really important to know that this is like a bio concept that we look at through a psychological lens. I have linked a video at the bottom of the slide that goes into identity a little bit differently than I've just done now, and it's got some drawings, but maybe that alternative, more informal perspective can help you understand that identity is this large category that has many mechanisms happening, and it will encompass a lot of what we've learned here today, the different selves and this and that. And it's also going to use some of this language here that we've just talked about. So go away today, watch that poem if you would like to watch that poem, watch this video if you would like to watch this video, engage with the resources. If you've done the reading, if you come to the next class with some idea of these key terms, you will be really well positioned to engage with what we have planned for next week. I will also say that there is a lecture on this week's thing in the Learn page by I don't remember her first name, but her last name is Park. So Professor Park, she is the pioneer of meaning making theory in relation to identity. So anytime you read something about meaning making, chances are it stems from her original ideas about it. And there's a short lecture I put on the Learn about her just sort of talking about this mechanism. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Once you see that everything that we do as social animals is driven and related to meaning, even who we are and who we want to be, you cannot unsee it. So this is one of the moments where this course might actually change how you function in the world afterwards, or at least make you more aware of things where we are both the subject and the observer. Okay, so that is everything from me today. Let me just have a look at the chat to see if there's any questions. Cannot understand independent self because I think independent self doesn't exist without the relationship with objects, people, events, culture. Yeah, that's a really good question. I have some resources that can help us better understand the independent self. I'll share those on the Learn page. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm just conscious of time. What is the relationship between a prototype and a stereotype? Oh, okay, good question. That one I can answer quickly. So a stereotype, if you think back to last week, if you were able to be with us last week, A stereotype is when we make a social inference about a person based on limited information. So you come to a conclusion about a person based on limited information that you're getting from visual stimuli about them, maybe auditory stimuli, like you see something that indicates they're part of a group or something like that. Like, for example, um, you're in the room that I'm in. I'm not your lecturer, I'm just a person. You see my skin tone, you hear my accent, you see that my style of dress is like Western. You maybe stereotype me as like, oh, Western individualist and whatever else comes along with that sort of stereotype. That's a stereotype. Prototype is something completely different. It's an idea that a large group has about the perfect member, about the person that could be 100% whatever that group membership is. I hope that that helps clarify. So they're not really related at all. They just sound similar. How does awareness of the extremes, limitations of an identity spectrum affect self-awareness, confidence in own identity in that group? Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think one I can begin to get at briefly. I'll give a bit and then we'll go into this next week as well. So awareness of extremes and limitations can definitely affect a person's confidence when it's really important to them to meet an ought self that that group is telling them to be, if this makes sense. So if that group is important to you and you feel like you lack in that group, you are probably going to be very down. You maybe will struggle with anxiety when you engage with behaviors related to the things that that group does. Um, so it can be very deeply linked to mood, thought process, our goals, the things that we want to do versus the things that we actually do. It can be deeply tied to our own sense of identity and mental health. Why is it some people have a strong sense of identity while others feel lost in who they are? Yeah, that's a nice question. I think that's a nice question to sort of wrap up the session. Um, so some of this is a product of change, and some of it is linked to age and life stage. So teenagerhood, adolescence, young adolescence, hallmark traits of that age stage is change. You are becoming more cognitively developed. You're thinking about things differently. You're aware of the world in a different way. You're maybe moving away from home for the first time, or you're studying in a university with people from different cultures as you, or maybe you've studied somewhere locally and culturally you're quite similar, but actually you come from different regions, or you don't know the same people, or you don't visit the same places or like the same food. So there's a lot of change going on in your life. It's easy to feel like, wow, everyone has so much identity except me. So when there's some stability in life, we can easily become more aware of identities that have endured throughout our life course. But also when we go through certain things like a trauma, and this is my area of research, like outside of teaching social psychology, I look at how trauma and identity are interlinked. So a good example about how identity can be like a positive functioning mechanism. Um, when someone goes through a trauma, one of the ways out of that trauma for most cases is, I don't know how to explain this in a few minutes without leaving important things understated. Finding meaning in a traumatic experience can be done when there is a relevant identity that gives you a sense of meaning. Now, I want to be really clear. I am not justifying trauma and saying, oh, if you just think about the trauma that you experienced in a particular way, that you'll feel better about it. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is sometimes an identity tied to a large group can give you coping resources or mechanisms to work your way over time with other support out of a trauma. Of course, it depends on the different levels of trauma here. But to give you an example, so as I said earlier, the work in Indonesia that I was doing with girls that survived natural disaster, a big part of their identity was their religion. A big part of how they overcame the sort of loss and devastation that they experienced. I would say overcoming that is a life process. It's not something that I think can be achieved at a certain point in time. It's something that you will continually work at. But these girls really clearly communicated in the research that through their religion, They were able to engage in rituals and practices that help them become more ingrained in their community, that help build relationships, that help them with philosophical questions, kind of like the problem of evil. Why do bad things happen to good people? That help them come to grips with these sorts of things through their identity. So whether they were having spiritual transformation, building relationships, it was linked to their identity. So in terms of why do some people feel lost while other people feel um, really close to their identity, it could be because those elements of identity are serving different purposes for you at that time, or maybe you're just undergoing a massive change and there's not really one identity that's showing its head more than the others, if that makes sense. So I think that that's a nice one. I'm going to just note down what these questions are that are coming in, and these are really good questions even for next week. So I'm just going to make a note of them, and I'll come back to them and answer them for you at another time. So next week we will be in person in our usual lecture hall. Um, there won't be any slides, or there won't be a lot of slides. I can tell you that in advance. Um, it'll be a bit interactive, so come prepared to chat with your colleagues, whether that's going to affect what you carry with you. We'll be moving around the class a little bit. So yeah, I don't know, wear something comfortable, come ready to talk to each other, to talk to me, and we'll do an activity next week. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for your flexibility. I'm going to stop the recording here and I will